That's a new fun thing that Zoom has created for us. So Howard Thurman once said, "You are never under obligation to preach a great sermon, but you are eternally obligated to grapple with great ideas. And if you grapple with great ideas, you might occasionally in a lifetime preach a great sermon." So I don't have any expectation that this will be a great sermon today, but I will say that grappling the next 2 weeks with the great ideas of Martin Buber and Howard Thurman might at least make for some great food for thought to all of you. So really, today's inspiration comes from the fact that this summer I've been taking a class from Boston University about Howard Thurman. And what fascinates me about Howard Thurman is that he was born in 1899. He was raised by his grandmother, who was an ex-slave, and he became the spiritual retreat for the civil rights movement without actually participating in the external expression of the movement himself. The following description comes from the documentary Backs Against the Wall, which talks about Howard Thurman and his life. Quote, "The paradox is that Thurman, who has a wide impact on the movement, is not himself a social reformer. He's much more a spiritual contemplative, what some would even call a mystic. But the mystic himself is not out on the front lines at many of the marches. And for that, he is often criticized. He was the teacher, the mentor, the spiritual sage. He was not the one who was on the front line, but he was the one where people would retreat to be refilled." An often quoted complaint about Thurman came from a young man in the civil rights movement who was heard complaining about Thurman one day. He says, "They were praying for a great freedom fighter, a liberator. You know, we thought we had a Moses and we got a mystic." But there were others within the movement, like Martin Luther King, Vincent Harding, Alice Walker, who understood and valued on a deep level the role that Thurman was playing in the civil rights movement. Otis Moss said of Thurman, quote, "He gave us a basis for the march, that we know why we march, the principles upon which we march, how we march, and what to do after we march. He helped to establish the philosophical framework for how we struggle." It has been said by many people that Martin Luther King carried Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with him most of the time when he traveled. And so, as I have been preparing to share Howard Thurman with all of you next week, I thought it might be helpful to be reminded of the theological spirit from which Thurman emerges. So in my limited research, I have no idea if Howard Thurman ever met Martin Buber, but I would be very surprised if Buber's concept of the I thou would be unfamiliar to Thurman, as most of Thurman's writings express this sentiment. Martin Buber was a German philosopher, existential theologian, who was born in 1878. So he was 20 years ahead of Thurman. And so today, in preparation for next week, I want us to revisit a concept that I shared with you all in February. And it is Martin Buber's concept of the I thou. And it will be within the context of this framework that I will attempt to introduce you to Howard Thurman and his amazing, yet behind the scenes influence on the civil rights movement next week. And I do this because I believe that understanding the spirit behind the struggle is very important. And I also want us to become familiar with Thurman and Buber almost 100 years later, because both Thurman and Buber have very important theological principles to share with us as human beings struggling with what it means to be alive in this world in the year 2021. So I've entitled this sermon today, the Agape of the Mystics. And in the video documentary of Thurman, Barbara Brown Taylor says, "What I think mysticism means is a person who relies on direct experience of the divine as being central and real in ways that institutional reception of the divine or even intellectual reception of the divine are inferior by comparison." So I'm going to repeat that. Mysticism is a mystic is a person who relies on direct experience of the divine as being central and real in a way that an institution like this very church we're in here right now, or even intellectual reception of the divine are inferior by comparison. So we can think about God and ultimate reality all we want, and we can talk about God and ultimate reality all we want, and we can create ritual around that. But what both Buber and Thurman refer to and are trying to express to us is their own inner experience of God and the divine. And that's what they were inviting us into, and almost 100 years ago, what they were inviting their congregations and their audiences into. So Martin Buber was considered a Jewish mystic existentialist, and Howard Thurman might be described as a Christian mystic. Although it's interesting because Thurman never or very rarely referred to the Christian religion. He often spoke about the religion of Jesus, rarely using the word Christianity, as he saw deep hypocrisy, disconnect, and divide between what he calls the religion of Jesus and the way Christianity is expressed in the United States of America. And what both of these theologians and philosophers, mystics have in common is how they understood the relationship between an ultimate loving reality and the human beings who are living that reality here on earth. And so today I want to reintroduce the concept of Buber's I thou, so that we will be prepared for Thurman's concept of the nerve center of consent next week. And hopefully before some of you start to think to yourselves, well, I'm not a theologian and I just don't think that way. My goal is to help these theological concepts come to life for you in a way that does and will bridge pure theological theory with the lived reality of our day-to-day lives. And hopefully that's the story that I gave about that beautiful interaction between Candace Sanders and the flower is an example of how we begin to make that relational connection between who we are and that which we are experiencing outside of ourselves. So when I first shared about Buber and the concept of I, thou back in February, the only images that would come to me were of one of our beloved members who recently passed away, named Dwayne Carr, as an example of a person whose heart was genuinely wide open, completely. Now, he wasn't perfect, but he was the best living example of a person I knew that genuinely had an open heart and was just willing to reach out and embrace everybody he met. And he loved to talk about the concept of agape love and that love that transcends individual human beings. The agape love of a divine nature expressing in all forms of life. And whenever he would talk about that concept of agape love, he always referred to Martin Buber's philosophy of the I-thou relationship. And so I can't separate my understanding of Martin Buber and I-thou without also having an image of Dwayne come to my mind. The two are forever interconnected in my mind's eye. So Martin Buber was an existentialist thinker who was born in Vienna in 1878, and he wrote his classic Ich und Du, I and Thou, in 1923, and it was translated from German into English in 1937. So from his Judaic theism perspective, Buber talks about the two ways we express in this world. According to Buber, as human beings, we are always viewing the world around us either as an I-it objectification or an I-you, I-thou relationship. The I-it expression happens when we view the world and the others in it as something apart from ourselves, as mere objects to interact with, whether it be another person, nature, or as Buber says, even God. And we see this so very often in our world today, this us, them, the good guys versus the enemies, preserving nature versus making corporate profits, and more recently, the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. There is me, and there is that which is outside of me, which I will manipulate for my own purposes. There is I, and there's everything else, which simply becomes in my lived reality a bunch of it's. And I would say this right now is how the majority of human beings interact in the world today, at least here in the United States. It's a world of separation and objectification of everything around us. And many times this objectification even includes the people we care about the most. So the other way to view the world, according to Buber, and expressed by Dwayne, was the I-you relationship, translated as I-thou. With this paradigm, I don't see you as an other. I don't see you as a thing or a means to an end. I see you in holy relationship with me. And where there is relationship, there is no separation. I see you as a divine you, thou. When we view the world from this perspective, we become a part of all that we view around us. We become relational. Buber gives the example of a tree. We can look at the tree as a collection of parts of leaves and wood and branches and roots to be chopped down and used for our own purposes as individual items to exploit. This is, I think, beautifully illustrated in Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, which is a classic story of a little boy who step by step used every part of a loving tree until all that was left was a stump that the boy, now as an old man, could use to sit on. In the end, the boy never offered the tree so much as one thank you. Or we can view the tree as a magnificent divine creature, creation with which we interact on a cellular level. Alan Chang summarizes Buber's analogy this way. It's not that there are two different worlds. It's more like there are two ways of looking at the same world. I can be an objective observer or a subjective participant. For example, when I study a tree and break it down into its parts, it then becomes an it rather than a you. When I'm in deep awe of the whole tree without trying to understand it, then it becomes a you or a thou. And when viewed this way, the tree becomes a divine expression of life that is interacting back with us. This relationship we have with the tree becomes an I-thou expression of divine relationship. No one expression of creation is more valuable or important than another. And we can see this in the indigenous worldviews, where the rivers are being granted citizenship rights, where the river becomes so much more than a body of water for us to use, abuse, and exploit for our own selfish means. And I shared this in February, this story. This was a BBC report on March 15th, 2017. And they reported that a river in New Zealand has become the first in the world to be granted the same legal rights as a person. The New Zealand Parliament passed the bill recognizing the Wahagani River in North Island as a living entity. Long revered by New Zealand's Maori people, the river's interests will now be represented by two people. The Maori had been fighting for 160 years to get this recognition for their river. A minister said, from a Wangani point of view, the well-being of the river is directly linked to the well-being of the people. And so it is really important that it's recognized as its own identity. Members of the Maori community celebrated the news with tears and music in New Zealand's parliament. The recognition of the I, thou. And so what if we began to incorporate this concept into our own lives with every living person around us and every living being around us? What if we viewed every interaction as a divinely inspired I-thou relationship? How might the world change? How might we be changed? And how might we just begin to possibly save the world and ourselves in the process? And so I invite us just to reflect on this concept today and throughout the week, and I will expand on it next week through the words and the writings and some of the actual voice of Howard Thurman. But I'm going to close today with these words from Martin Luther King, who was deeply, deeply inspired and was an actual mentor of Howard Thurman. Martin Luther King would go out, do the marches, and then he would go and sit in Howard Thurman's living room and they would talk together about how they understood what was going on. And so Martin Luther King wrote in The Role of the Church in Facing the Nation's Chief Moral Dilemma in 1957. He wrote, "But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform oppressors into friends. The type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love, not philia, the sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization." Those words spoken 1957. So it makes me think we might have a ways to go. And it offers me a sense of hope. And so as we just reflect on these words and these concepts, let us have a little bit of music that might just also express the joy that can be found within the reality of the I-thou relationship.
I see trees of green roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, and also of the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies grow, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We need somebody with a good voice to sing us out. Jan, you're on choir. Will you sing us out?
Go your way.
Way in peace, wander as you may. Blessed is the path you take. May love guide you on your way.
Thank you, Jan and Janver. If you are on Zoom and you would like to continue to be part of a virtual coffee hour, just stay online and I'll set up some breakout rooms. If you are here in person, we have a little bit of coffee in the back and feel free to stay and talk to each other a little bit. And if you just need to get on with your day, we send you with love and peace until we are again together this time next week, same place, same time. So go now in peace, everybody, and we will see you soon.